Okay, we are right at the top of the hour, so welcome everybody. We have some great presentations today. I don't want to take too long at the beginning here because I don't want to step on anyone's time. You can see some responses to Mentimeter coming up, and that is the reason that we're asking this question about MTSS. What topics related to MTSS are you interested in learning more about? Is because Kristen Brown at Colorado Department of Education worked with Denver University to do some interviews and a survey and put it all together in a report related to MTSS. And specifically, they reached out to different states who were implementing MTSS.
Don't get up.
Sorry, if you're just joining, if you all could mute yourselves. And unless you have responses, I guess this. And so one of the things we found from that report was that states were interested in working in smaller groups of states on different aspects of MTSS and getting some support in that and sharing resources. And so we, of course, we SIG Network want to support you. And so what we're doing now is getting some thoughts from you via Mentimeter. And then we're also going to do a survey, send out a survey that Kelsey has put together with me. And you will have a chance to say if you want to be in a small working group or if you just want this large group information like in our directors webinars. So this is just a starter, but your responses to the Mentimeter right now is going to give us an idea of whether we've left anything out in terms of topics and ideas for that survey. So this is really usable information. You can see family engagement, tracking intervention, streamlining early childhood student outcomes have all come out of this. And also valid, I am new, so I'm not sure. And MTSS is big, so I think all of us are sometimes a little unsure what we need to focus on when it comes to MTSS. All right, so that's an introduction of why we were doing Mentimeter. You still have a few minutes to enter that while I talk about today, if you would like to take that time. And Kelsey, thank you for putting that together for us. All right, so today's presentations, we have two presentations about data. And this came up for me because I was at CSEP, State Implementation and Scaling Up of Evidence-Based Practice, DA Center's Active States Forum, which is for the intensive states that they work with. They get together, they share with each other, they ask questions of each other. And I was lucky enough to be in a breakout session with Dr. Chimaobi Amuta. And actually, Chimaobi, I should have checked with you about the pronunciation of your last name. So feel free to correct me when you get on. And he is passionate about data visualization and great at sharing what goes into it for his role in the New Jersey Department of Education. So the reason I thought it was so important to bring his knowledge to you is because he was talking that day about how they're choosing which districts / schools to work with when it comes to using the implementation science effort for their MTSS and other efforts, I should say. So they were looking to determine who they should work with, and they were using data to make these decisions. And, you know, if you're using stakeholder engagement and if you're having participation from other offices in your SEA, et cetera, you need to be able to talk about these data, show these data in a way that really connects with people. And so that's what he was talking about that day. And that's what connected for me. I think that data visualization goes beyond just determining who needs your support. It can be used for needs assessment, but it can also be used for once you've started your work. So I would love for you all to be thinking about, from the beginning of your project all the way through full implementation, when you're showing your impact, what that data visualization might mean for you. And then we also have Tom Delaney, who is the project director for Minnesota's SPDIG. They just received a new grant in fiscal year 2020, and it is focused on Native American students. And I thought, I know some of their work from their SIP and from their last SPDIG, and now this current SPDIG, what they're planning on doing. And I think they've just done such a nice job looking really closely at the data to determine which Native American students have a need, where they're located, how they can be supported, et cetera. And so he's going to talk about data disaggregation. And I think we talk about big equity and the needs we have for big equity. And if we are not able to disaggregate the data to determine the needs and to determine how we're impacting those needs, I don't see how we're going to move the needle very much in that area at all. So I thought that's why it was important to hear from Tom today. You received a more thorough description of each presentation, so you can look back at your email from this morning if you'd like to read that. I also wanted to let you know that if we have time today, Kristen Brown was kind enough to agree to talk about that MTSS report I was just sharing with you. So if we have time, she's going to talk about it today. If we don't have time today, she is going to start us off in September. So she's being truly flexible with her time, and of course is always so generous. I hear that from a lot of people. She's a great partner to SIG Network, for all of you, for us. So thank you, Kristen. All right. So with that, we stayed pretty much the same with Mentimeter, early childhood. What does that mean for MTSS? Family engagement, equity, tracking interventions, streamlining sustainability. These are great. Thank you so much for your input. You should see some of this show up in that survey that we'll be sending to you. Again, please respond to it. Even if you're not planning on being in a small working group, we still want to know if you're interested in large group information, presentations, et cetera, and how we can support you. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chimobi. And again, he worked for New Jersey Department of Education and has one of the cooler titles. You're the data visualization, I have it right here, but you're the data visualization
expert.
So that's it. That's it. No, so to speak. Just, it's okay to just be. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks for joining us, Chimobi.
Wonderful. Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jennifer. So I'm going to share my screen and get into our presentation for today. Very happy to be with you all. Like Jennifer said, we initially met through the CISEP Active States Forum. And I think that conversation around data was something that, I can talk about all day. I always appreciate being able to share what we're doing in New Jersey with others. And of course, learning from what other states are doing as well. So always a welcome opportunity. So here I'm going to talk about what we've been doing in New Jersey as part of the CISEP initiative. We've been engaged with it for quite a while now. I'll talk a bit about background information in a moment. But the important part to know about our CISEP initiative is that it is a rare opportunity for cross-divisional collaboration. Us and CISEP, or NERN, out of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, we're focused on increasing our capacity to implement and scale up best practices in our schools throughout New Jersey. So cross-divisionally, a number of different groups are a part of this. The Division of Academics and Performance around our standards, the Division of Early Childhood, given our focus on literacy support. We also have field services, of which I'm part of that division, which really does a lot of the interfacing with schools and districts on the ground and ongoing support mechanisms. And then also our Division of Student Services, which I believe OSEP works with quite a bit and oversees our special education supports for our pupils. So it's been going on for approximately 2 years, this work project. It's very deliberate and careful, the work that we've engaged in. And I think that sometimes, I'm sure you all have heard the saying, to go far, go slowly. And I think we're really trying to adhere to that and not just rush into being reactionary as we are sometimes in education and seeing an issue and trying to work really quickly and diligently, behind the clock to address it. We're really trying to be careful and research-driven in what our approach to working with our K-3 students with disabilities are. There was a whole nother data analysis process that came about and that led us to pick K-3 literacy for students with disabilities that we engaged in spring of 2020. But in this past spring of 2021, like Jennifer said, we focused on which districts do we work with. We have many districts throughout New Jersey, nearly 700. And so it was really important to figure out in this transformation zone, as it's termed, which districts do we work with that are demonstrating significant need in our focal area that might warrant our support. And so in pursuit of that, we had this particular task. I think in the context of this, there was a strong importance of being data-driven. I think sometimes we are, like I said, reactionary in education, not just at the SEA level, but at varying levels. And I think that being data-driven and trying to be as objective as possible in how we approach the work that we're doing is really important. So as opposed to going where...
So I'm so sorry to interrupt. You're going out a little bit, in and out a little bit. I'm not sure if there's anything you can do with your mic or not.
Potentially not. Might be a Wi-Fi zone. But
I couldn't tell exactly what might be causing it, but okay. I just wanted you to know in case there was something that just needed to be set for the mic.
I appreciate it.
Thanks.
So, if that keeps happening, I'll see what I can do to maybe move my my station. But so we talked about the importance of being data-driven in the work and trying to be more objective than subjective in selecting our transformation zone districts. We talked about looking at diverse settings, both geographically and demographically. I think that people might be surprised at times to know just how diverse geographically New Jersey is. We're, a lot of highways and a lot of urban areas, but we are still intensely suburban and intensely rural as well. We have places like Union City in northern New Jersey that have a density nearly the same as New York City. Actually more dense than many parts of New York City outside of Midtown and Lower Manhattan. But we also have geographic diversity where we have an area such as the Pine Barrens that's essentially an immense forest in South Jersey that is larger than Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City, and Houston combined. So we're a very diverse state geographically and demographically. And then we also wanted to emphasize the importance of pre-existing collaborative relationships with the personnel that we work with in schools and districts. So that's where our division largely comes in field services. We have ongoing relationships with a variety of schools and districts that have comprehensive and targeted schools, just like all of your states have identified comprehensive and targeted schools as part of the ESSA plan that you all have been implementing for the past few years. We have those schools in New Jersey as well. And so our field services teams that work with these schools intensely already have some pre-existing relationships and know where district and school leaders might be collaborative and open to working together on this initiative. So those were some of our considerations in thinking about where we're going to focus throughout this vast state of New Jersey to implement this initiative. So the metrics, I think some of the things that we did in order to come to these metrics, across our cross-divisional team with various personnel from numerous divisions and offices, we just really had a brainstorming session where we talked about the various things that we wanted to have included in the selection process for which districts we work with. So here's kind of the parsed down list. The list was more extensive, but of course there are limitations in what data we have available. So one of the considerations was the length of tenure for the superintendent in a particular district. And we don't have that data readily available at our fingertips. We were putting it together, but weren't quite able to get that together in time for the meeting. So these are the metrics that we presently had. A few explanatory details at the bottom. When I use comparative terms such as high or low, of course, that's all relative. So high presence of SWD or students with disabilities, that relates to it being, a bit higher than the state average. Statewide, across all of our schools and districts, the average is 17.4%. So high in this case was any district that had 20% or more students with disabilities present in their district. And then local district graduation rate was the lowest 10% of graduation rates by district in the state. So that's about 31 districts with high schools in the state. So those districts also were part of what was included. But in this context, it was very important to not only look at the district that might need a lot of our support, but something that our SciSep team reminds us of is the importance of looking at districts that are doing especially well in this area. Unfortunately, those districts are few and far between because there's just a broad need for greater support for students with disabilities and early literacy as these students get not just acclimated to the science of reading and the work of reading, but also to school settings kind of in general. It's quite a challenge. So this is what we were looking to do in this part of the project. And I think that these metrics were especially helpful to kind of whittle down in an objective and data-driven way which districts we're looking at in order to support them with this initiative. So one of the things I think about that I wanted to ask the group is, are there any other considerations that we might have considered when selecting districts? Here are just the parameters that we came up with as a team in New Jersey, but of course, the more minds that are sort of working on an issue, the better, I generally think. So are there any other criteria that you all might have used if you were part of the working team or in doing similar work in your states, where there's a particular criteria that you felt was important to consider in this selection process?
And folks should feel free either to use your mic or to use the chat. I just typed the question in. So what Chimobi is asking, what are criteria or considerations you've used to select districts beyond the 7 he has listed here?
Right. And I'm sure for a variety of different initiatives that you all have going on in your states, not just something that's comparable to this in terms of a very targeted grade band and content area support, but just more broadly in selecting districts to partner with. And of course, all districts in the state are partners in ongoing work, but particularly for a specialized initiative based on need. Have there been particular criteria that you all used in thinking through how we might select districts? Because our list isn't set in stone. We have approval from the commissioner to work with the districts that we've sort of highlighted, but of course, like all good plans, it's subject to change if need be. Okay, so I'm seeing poverty rates from Corinne and Kate. So a question I have about poverty rates, often in education, we use free reduced price lunch as sort of a measure of poverty in a local community. But are you all thinking of localized poverty rates more from census data, or are you thinking about from schooling and education data for reduced price lunch? Tiffany said the same. You send the academic outcomes for SWD. That's captured a bit in, this is the second metric, the percentile of students with disabilities. Their performance percentile is what that reflects. Corinne, could you tell me more about high disproportionality and what you mean by that?
Yeah, a few years ago, the state of Virginia had a school climate transformation grant, and we were able to pull disproportionality data for, I believe it was out of school suspensions at the time from the VDOE, and identify districts for potential collaboration through those numbers.
Okay. So I'm assuming by that you mean that particular subgroups of students were disproportionately subject to out of school suspension?
Correct. Correct.
That makes a lot of sense. Yep, no performance statewide assessments, number of out of field.
Yeah, did you see the number of out of field teachers, Chimobi?
Yep, absolutely. That's an intriguing consideration as well. And I would imagine one of our offices has that data, but that wasn't something we considered as a team. So thank you for that, Peg. Okay, so with these metrics, I think that it was, up to me as, in addition to being a data visualization expert for my office, I'm also the state transformation specialist for the SciSep initiative. So I think sometimes some of the data analysis that falls on my plate is right up my alley, but it's also very helpful to be able to pull the data from sort of my main work streams into this type of work. So it was very easy and seamless in this instance, at least. So the product. The work product that we ended up producing was a spreadsheet in Excel that also functioned as a dashboard. So I wanted to pull you all into that and show you what that looks like. So let me share my Excel screen. So can everyone see this okay? Okay.
Yeah, I can see it.
Wonderful. So essentially what I did was I pulled in the various data. I'll go over the raw data tab a bit in a moment. But what I did was I pulled that data that we talked about, the various inclusion criteria, into this dashboard. So at this top part, you see the number of inclusion criteria met is sort of the main bar chart that I included. And then below that, you have a variety of the metrics that we also just talked about. The average student with disability percentile. So of the schools in the district that are identified for targeted support for students with disabilities, I looked at their percentile. So if they have multiple schools, of course, there's an actual average. But if there's just one school, I just use the average of that school that's identified for students with disabilities. Scrolling down a bit more, the percent of students with disabilities in a district, and then also the district graduation rate was the last metric. But of course, this is a bit unwieldy and kind of difficult to really discern across the school districts. Again, we have nearly 700 school districts in the state, and that's as many as South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi combined. We're very strong believers of apparently a local control in New Jersey, and we have some very large districts and we have some very small districts throughout the state. So what I did on the left side was I created, functionally buttons, but in Excel they're called slicers. So I created 2 slicers, one at the county level to disaggregate data at the county level, and then one at the inclusion criteria met level to disaggregate data like that. So if I look at the data for my birth county of Mercer, clicking on Mercer only pulls up the data for those Mercer districts. So now we have the group of districts that are in Mercer County, and we have the inclusion criteria that were met in each district. We also have the average student with disability percentile for any targeted schools within those districts in Mercer County. And we have the percent of students with disabilities that are in each of the districts in Mercer County. If I clicked out of that and went to my current county of residence, Camden County, same thing. We can see just the school districts in Camden County now. More easy to discern to an extent than looking at all the districts in the state. That's one of the ways you can sort of splice this down to get to where you're looking at. But then you can also couple that with looking at inclusion criteria. So if I was looking at Camden County and I said, how many districts in Camden County meet 2 inclusion criteria, it would show 1. It would show that Pennsauken is the only one. If I looked at how many met 1 inclusion criteria, that's several more across the county. So through these 2 mechanisms, through these 2 slicers, we looked at the data statewide, and we just took some time to see just general wonderings and learnings and observations about the data as a whole group. So we looked through each of these, and I gave the working group time to just jump out with which districts are sort of, they're noticing are in need of special support. Also keeping in mind the considerations around the demographic and geographic diversity of the state. In our office, we split the state into 3 different regions, North, South, and Central. And so also thinking about where different districts are located in the state, and also, of course, where the different counties are in the state, because for the most part, each county is somewhat cleanly in a particular region. So all of this was fed by the raw data on this next tab. So, and this is really just the metrics that we talked about a moment ago. Just use a simple binary scale to see if the inclusion criteria was met. It got a 1. If it was not met, it got a 0. And then that fed into this column D. And then, this is a bit technical, but then that ended up fueling the pivot charts that ended up becoming, the pivot tables, and instead it ended up becoming pivot charts to create what you just saw on the dashboard tab. But certain metrics don't necessarily have, or certain information doesn't necessarily have a metric. I talked about the importance of suburban, urban, and rural designations, but it doesn't necessarily have a metric that goes along with that. But just in consideration of these different districts, when we came down to it, the districts that we ended up selecting were a good mix of urban, suburban, and a few districts that I would consider rural given their county makeup, but are technically classified as urban because, to an extent, all of New Jersey is considered urban because the southern half of the state is sort of in greater Philadelphia, northern half of the state is sort of in greater New York City. So even though we have quite a bit of farmland, New Jersey is the Garden State, we are still considered, overwhelmingly metropolitan and urban from top to bottom. Okay, so I will jump back into the PowerPoint. So one of the things that we considered with this is, of course, this ongoing, the importance of equity in all of our work is ongoing and something that I think has come to the forefront very much so in the past year. But for us in our Office of Climate Hazard Support, it's been at the center of our work the entire time we've been engaged in it. So thinking about different groups of students, historically marginalized groups of students, those students that definitely warrant the most support in our school settings, whether based on race, based on class, based on disabilities, based on language status. These different considerations are really important to us here here in New Jersey, but then also especially in our office and in this sort of work. So some of those considerations, of course, student with disabilities inherently is a group where equity is at the center of the work that we do with students with disabilities. It's really important in particular because when you think of parity in education, you know, there's a school of thought that says parity of opportunity, and there's a school of thought that says parity of outcome, you know, get you to equity. But I think you need, as much as possible, both. Of course, you need the inputs and what's going into education regarding funding, regarding teacher quality, regarding facilities, and those types of supports. But then, of course, ideally, eventually getting to closing the achievement gap between students with disabilities and general education students is really important. What we saw in New Jersey was about 1 in 4 students with disabilities at 3rd grade were achieving proficiency on or meeting expectations, I should say. We're meeting expectations on the state language test, but then about 56% of students, general education students statewide in 3rd grade, were meeting expectations on the statewide test. So less than half the rate of students statewide who are general education students were meeting their targets in special education settings. So also thinking about student disability percentiles, of course, there's a wide variety. If you look at particular districts that we have, their percentiles are quite lower than other districts that we have, where we either have schools that are identified for targeted support or we don't have schools that are identified for targeted support. So there's not sort of a, so it's not sort of a monolith of those schools that we work with within the Comprehensive Support Network and our Office of Comprehensive Support. There are still quite significant differences from district to district at times. And then of course, population density is sort of a conduit of demographic diversity, but definitely something to consider as we look at the various settings that students live and teachers teach in. And I think that, you know, I'm especially sensitive to that, even though as a native of a city here in New Jersey, I started my teaching career in Mississippi and then went over to Arkansas for 2 years as well. And so I think that the realities of rural education, in addition to suburban and urban education, are very much warranting intensive support. And I think one of the things that our accountability system has revealed to us in the past 6 years is how that population of students in rural parts of New Jersey, just like elsewhere in the country, definitely warrant particular support and attention, in addition to the suburbs and our urban areas more generally. So I've done a lot of talking, and since I'm from New Jersey, I talk especially fast. So I wanted to stop there and see if there are any questions that you all have for me, anything about the data collection process, which unfortunately was largely simple, given that I used extant data and didn't necessarily collect new data, and then anything around my analyses or development of the data dashboard that you all wanted to ask at this time. So let me take a peek at the chat.
Yeah, this is a great time to, oh, yeah, we have a question.
Okay.
Oh, you see them. Okay, go ahead.
Were any of the variables weighted more heavily than others in making determination of assistance? No, they weren't. We didn't have a conversation around weighting the different variables. We just kind of kept each one, equivalent. And so across the 7 criteria that we had that we developed metrics for, or not all metrics in terms of coming out to something quantifiable, but in terms of the various variables that we used for this project, they were all weighted the same.
Is there anything that surprised you, Chimobi, as you were working with the data? Anything that you hadn't maybe guessed before you started to look at things in a different way?
Not especially. The schools that I was analyzing data for are overwhelmingly our schools that we work with within our office. So I'm constantly immersed in their data. It's also been a bit fortunate. I shouldn't say fortunate, but it's been easier, I should say, over the past 2 years as we haven't had fresh assessment data. So the assessment data from spring 19, that's the most recent data that we have. I've been looking at this for over 2 years now. And so something I'm very familiar with, and I've been manipulating in a variety of ways outside of our SciSep work, but it's something that didn't necessarily surprise me. But I was thinking about how to share this with the team. I always think of how to translate what I'm looking at on a regular basis to other individuals who might not interface with this data in the same ways that I do or as regularly as I do, which is something that I think about a lot in our context of work. Because as much as I can get into the weeds with metrics and all of the things that we look at as data personnel on a regular basis, it's very important to be able to communicate that effectively to the decision makers who are making critical decisions for children based on these metrics. So thank you, Chinwe. And then from Laura, any challenges with obtaining the data? So the data that ended up being included, I would say no, there weren't any major challenges. I know the different data warehouses that we have at the New Jersey Department of Ed, and I know how to access all of those data. And then also where data wasn't available, we did start some of those collection mechanisms to get that data, but things take time, and we were on a particular schedule for getting this data. So I think that it was all relatively easy to obtain, but if we wanted a fresh data collection, it would have been perhaps a different case. But even in the context of COVID, similar to all of your states, we're very conscious of what data we request from schools and districts. And so in addition to the regular, cyclical data that we request at our snapshots for our data warehouse, we also have been asking for a variety of new data over the past 18 months with COVID. And so I was especially sensitive to that and didn't want to do any sort of novel data collection, engage in that process. So all of the data was already in existence, fortunately. And then Tiffany, how do you predict COVID will impact this project and how will the team move forward? So one of the things that I think about, Tiffany, is that a number of our school districts are still not allowing outside personnel into their district, including state personnel. Given COVID, you have to be a student, or I believe in many situations, parents aren't allowed inside the school building as well. Which is, a reality of our current circumstance. But I think that's going to definitely impact our work if we're not able to work in person with schools and districts, and we have to continue to provide that sort of support and implementation assistance virtually. That's definitely going to be a challenge as we hope to get into schools beginning next month. So we look forward to figuring that out. And then Janice said, I often wonder how much leadership transitions at the school and district level impact the performance of this subgroup. Absolutely. And I wish we would have got that metric, Janice, that metric around the length of tenure for the superintendent, because I think that influences a lot in a school and district as well. And I think that's also sometimes a measure of stability. Well, it's an obvious measure of stability within the district, but not just at that highest level of leadership. I think of that in terms of stability of programming, of initiatives, of principles, and how all of that is influenced by who the person sitting in a big chair is at the superintendent level. Oh, thank you, Dana.
Shimobi, you're getting a lot of love in the chat. I wanted to ask you, just for myself, how much access do you have, or how much knowledge do you have, data or otherwise, about the curricula that are being used by districts?
So we have some level of knowledge around that. I would say that for, so we have the bigger level of all of our districts, our nearly 700 districts, where I would say that the the Division of Academics and Performance might have a stronger handle on that. But for our district that we work with in the Office of Comprehensive Support, through their annual school plans, we do have a good sense of what they're using, what assessment tools they're using, reading programs, math programs, and the various supports they're offering to particular populations of students. So we do have a good sense of what's happening there. And other personnel on our team are starting to roll up some of that data to see what trends exist, and also connecting the programming used or the different supports used by our different school partners to the outcomes that they're seeing, of course, over the course of time. So that's an exhaustive process that takes a lot of analysis at a micro level of SMART goals and of strategies, and looking at that over the course of multiple years for nearly 300 schools. So it's quite an undertaking amidst our various other data projects, but it is something that we're looking at because I think that is important to get a sense of the curricula that our schools are using, especially at that K-3 level for this initiative, and getting a sense of how it's working for them. Because oftentimes the way I phrase things to schools is in the change process, what do you want to start? What do you want to stop? And what do you want to continue? So in that, I think doing what has been done is often a way that schools go because it's what they're comfortable with and what is normal to them. But I think part of our task is pushing for new thought and infusing innovative thought in their work settings, sometimes with a thought partner, which I think is something we all enjoy doing. Let me check the chat once more. Okay.
Yeah, and while you're looking at that, I was having a thought. Probably like 5 to 7 years ago, there was a report from a department-funded, U.S. Department of Education funded center, and it was talking about districts that you would not expect to do as well as they do. Yeah, there's a term for those districts, and so they showed which districts were doing better than you would expect, but there was there was just the data that they were doing better than you would expect. And I was
Right.
so frustrated.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for anyone else if you can't say what's actually happening for the students every day? Right.
Right. And I think that's one of our challenges in education, and something else that our data team is trying to tackle. We're generally really good at quantifiable data. Those quantitative aspects of assessment results and attendance and funding are really easy and simple for us to get at. But I think the heart of it, as a qualitative researcher, to a certain extent, the heart of a lot of that is qualitative data that we don't necessarily have. The why did this work? Why was this a remaining challenge from principal to principal or superintendent to superintendent? What is our institutional memory at the SCA level or at the LEA level that could come to bear on our ongoing work? And so trying to get to that qualitative data is something that we're working on now. Of course, most of us aren't trained in qualitative data analysis. Most of us, jump into Excel or Stata or R and go at it. But I think that qualitative data is extremely important and rich, like you're getting at, Jennifer, and to figure out the why behind the metrics that we see at the end of the day. And Tom, you're absolutely right. The DCA that we're going to be working with SciCep, we just talked about that with our contacts with SciCep, and so it's something we're going to be engaging with over the next probably 6 weeks, quite a bit.
Right. And Terry Marks was kind enough to give me that term. It was beating the odds. That's what the schools and the districts are called, who have the data that, the data you were showing would seem to say that they weren't going to have great academic outcomes. I think it's the main thing that they look at.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And I agree, Laura. Mixed methods is important. You want the details and the sort of the quick hits of quantifiable data that that's easy to provide via a metric, but you also definitely want those rich, thick, as they're called in my grad school courses, those rich, thick descriptions that come from qualitative data analysis. Yeah, determining are beating the odds is something that we're working on, and not just at the school level, but also in particular districts that we have a strong presence in, given their concentration of targeted and comprehensive schools. We also want to go to the school, to the teacher and the student level to figure out, what's happening in particular in those classrooms and with those pupils, to say, why are these individuals performing so dramatically different than some of their peers, and really trying to gain more learning to influence our support that we do on an ongoing basis. But all of that learning is really important and fun, but it is comprehensive, and it's and it takes time and careful attention and methods of data collection that are not necessarily the forte of the department. And so it's critical, so it needs to happen, and that's just good.
Yeah, well, we are lucky with the SPDIG program that almost every SPDIG has an external evaluator. And it's just such a gift that we have the opportunity to have that critical friend bring these questions and what is possible and having a little bit of a different perspective. And I saw that there are quite a few of our evaluators on today. So I know they appreciate this conversation as well as the project folks. And it's been nice to see the chat and the interaction going on there. So I know you've got our thinking going. It'd be great to have you come back at some point in time and talk about how the work is going and what you've learned from it, and you would do differently with the criteria from what you've learned, etc.
Always want to tweak and get better, because hindsight's 2020, and I think of what I know about data analysis now that could have helped me in the classroom a decade ago or in leadership, and definitely would love to share those learnings. Something else that I think that we should do far more in education across SEAs and from the federal level to the state level, sharing what we're learning in the field.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for spending your time with us, and we appreciate you. And again, we'll see you in the future, and good luck with the how long have you been a state transformation specialist for?
So this role has been really for maybe a year and a half, sort of formally, but it's work that in different ways we've been engaging in for quite a while. But as the representative from my division, it's been important work and very much in line with what a variety of our divisions are doing, but coming together to do it in a concerted manner is novel and exciting. So.
Yeah, it really is. And so for those of you who have not heard of a state transformation specialist, when a state is working intensively or actively with CSEP, they require that there be 2 state transformation specialists in the state. And really, the state transformation specialist is in charge of systems change for the entire state. So it's a big job working with the state level across offices, the regional level if that exists, the district level, and the schools, making sure everyone's communicating, they're using the data. Everyone understands how to use our implementation teams. I could go on and on. It's a really big job. So I'm glad you're in that role. Okay.
Thanks for inviting me, Jennifer. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much, Shamoe. All right. Oh yeah, and Stephen Barr brought up moving your numbers from NCSO, the report on high performing districts who performed above expectations. Thank you. All right. So Tom Delaney is our next presenter, and I gave you a little bit of preparation and about what he was going to talk about. It's really fun to have him speak to you about this because I know how excited he is about the work that they're engaging in with Native American students. He is fully immersed, and he's going to tell you probably a little bit about what that immersion looks like, but in the culture, especially the culture of the Lakota people, and cares so much about this work and is doing a fantastic job about making sure that they reach the students who have a need, using the data to figure out who those are, and that they're going to do it in a way that's really has an impact and a lasting impact. So Tom, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, I think that's my cue. Let me attempt to share my screen here. Okay, and if you can't see that, unmute and scream right now.
It looks great. No screaming.
All right, hi everyone. I am Tom Delaney from the state of Minnesota and the great state of Minnesota, Minnesota Department of Education. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about using data to engage historically underserved students with disabilities. And I'm really flattered and honored and grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you. You know, I'm on these calls with you at least monthly as well. And you're a great bunch and there's some great minds in here. So today, hopefully I'll be able to talk about a little bit of what we're doing and share some things that you can connect with. But the main thing is I'm always open to learning as well. So the only way I've ever seen progress happen is by talking with others and picking up learning and insights. And in a community like ours here, I think that's very important, especially in these present challenging times. So know that on the front end, I have this open invitation for you to share your connections, insights, ideas, questions, whatever you have. Now I'm going to try to successfully advance the slide. In the Minnesota Department of Education, we as an agency, down to the individual staff member, share 10 Minnesota commitments to equity. And every time we speak about what we're doing, we intentionally address that we are intentionally seeking equity in multiple ways. It's a value that shows up in our mission statements across our divisions. And every time we speak, we are to identify what are we going to be talking about today. So there's 10 things that we focus on. I like to pick 3 because it's like, okay, 10's a lot and they're all important. But what's really the deal today? And then the other thing is I'm 53 years old. So when the list gets beyond 3 things, if it's beyond milk, eggs, butter, you're taking your chances with me. So I want to highlight what are the things that I'm going to try to talk about today. And number 1 is prioritizing equity. We're going to be talking about using data to engage with historically underserved students with disabilities and their families. Okay, and that's part of developing a public education system that truly serves all and provides opportunity to all, provides benefit to all as it's designed to do. My favorite is number 4, go local. In my experience, we can run all the state level data that we want, but we're not going to know what's going on and we're not going to be able to bump a number unless we get down to the local level to see what's going on and to engage with a thing and the various processes that work together to make that big state number. I also have this belief, and your experience may affirm this, any positive change that ever happens really boils down to people. It's a person somewhere who does something differently. It's a person somewhere who thinks differently, who says something differently. But it always comes down to a human being or a group of human beings does something, all right? So when I talk about going local, I really have that in mind as well, that whenever we want to do something, we've got to find the people to do it, right? Otherwise, things will remain at very lofty, abstract levels, somewhat distal from what's actually going on. And so that's something I really try to pay attention in the work. And that also leads to number 8, value people. Again, any positive change comes down to people doing something. And related back to equity, every person is valuable. Every student is valuable. I'll tell you in a second, I started out in the alternative education, sort of, the latter part of the movement in the 90s in Minnesota. And the thing that I schooled my staff on, and we all held a value that I've never lost, is maybe what I would call extreme ownership of students, okay? Really regarding students and including students with disabilities, but at-risk kids, everything else we had back then and still do. Owning them as our children, owning them as our students. So that's another piece I try to bring in highlighting what I'm going to talk about in terms of commitments to equity today. So I wanted to share that with you so you have a little bit of a picture of where I'm coming from. All right, brief introduction. My style of speaking, the sometimes interesting examples I use, you'll understand a little bit better if you know a little bit about my background. Okay, so I just find it helpful to understand who's this guy that's talking to you. So I am the SPDG director in Minnesota. I also have the job of being the supervisor of interagency partnerships in Minnesota. And what that job entails, my job, is wherever programs and policies overlap between state agencies or even local agencies like school districts and counties, I try to get the pieces together so that the intended benefit to real students and families happens, okay? And again, it relates back to where I got my start. It's the thing I love to do, is figure out how to put pieces together to make change happen that's observable for kids and for families. You should be able to get a video camera out and say, this is where things used to be. Now look at how things are now, and see that positive difference. A couple other things I do is I am the team lead for our division's focus on education, the most integrated setting. And that's for not just students with disabilities, but all students with mental health challenges, students of all demographic categories, working strategically to ensure that every student is in the most integrated setting possible. And I also work on our department's Indigenous Education Task Force and Action Team. A couple of years ago, we had a renewed emphasis on what are we doing about educating in Native American or Indigenous students in the state of Minnesota. And we had the opportunity to really pull together and say, what do we want to see happen, and do some planning. And I had the honor of being part of that. I also want to put out there right now too, you're going to hear me interchangeably using the terms Indigenous, Native American, or the federal term American Indian. And all of those terms, I'll try to be clear about what I'm talking about. And in all cases, my intention is to speak with respect as well. In the past, I was a non-traditional education program specialist, which kind of means when things weren't working out for regular kids, I tried to figure out ways to educate them in new and different ways: charter schools, alternative schools, everything else. I have a background as a co-facilitator of a Dakota and Ojibwe language revitalization project that we did here in Minnesota. And I worked in the place called the American Indian Family Center. I'm well grounded in PBIS. I was a PBIS implementation administrator in St. Paul. I still love it. You can talk to the 15-year-old and 13-year-old that run around here. I think I've got them pretty schooled up on PBIS as well. And it all started with an alternative high school I started. And if you run into any of those stories, there were just a lot of kids in the community I started out in that dropped out of school, not going anywhere, getting involved with different aspects of systems that were not helping them. So I started an alternative school in a trailer with a broken toilet and one student. and an idea. And a year later, we had our own building. We had a 6-month waiting list. We ran from 8 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock at night. And I loved it. And as much as I love the department, I still kind of miss those days. So that's kind of helps you understand where I'm coming from. And now we're going to get into it. All right. What I want to do today is, when I thought about what Jennifer is asking me to do, what I can offer is I'm going to share with you our experience in Minnesota on the topic of using data to engage historically underserved students. I am not a top-notch researcher. You can Google me. I think I was part of a research article somewhere back in the early 90s or something, and that's been about it. Okay, so when I speak, I'm a practitioner. I can only speak from experience, and I want to talk about some things we're doing here in Minnesota and share them with you. And like I said, in the hopes that maybe you'll connect with them, or maybe we'll have something to talk about. Here's what I want to talk about today. Here's my goals. I want to address a few questions. First one is, what are the challenges in using data to engage with historically underserved students with disabilities and their families? I'm going to talk about the challenges we faced in Minnesota. You may have faced the same challenges. You may have other challenges where you're working that may be unique to your state or unique to the type of thing you're trying to make happen. But I'll talk a little bit about the challenges we've experienced in Minnesota. I'm not going to just leave you hanging with challenges, okay? I'm also going to talk about what are some data-based decision-making strategies in engaging schools and students in the places where it will at least start to make a difference. And I can tell you it's going to look a little familiar from what we just talked about. I also want to talk about what are the important categories of data in engaging with historically underserved students with disabilities. And lastly, I hope to talk about what are some strategies for validating data related to historically underserved students with disabilities, as well as resulting priorities and strategies you come up when you use that. I'm going to use our work with Minnesota's indigenous communities in our state personnel development grant as sort of the case study today. So I want you to have a real quick background on that. That'll help keep our conversation going. In the state of Minnesota, we are the home of 2 major tribes. One is the Anishinaabe, also known as Chippewa or Ojibwe, and they have 7 reservations in our state. The other tribe are the Dakota, also known as Sioux or part of the Sioux community, the Ochati-Sahuin. They have 4 communities in the southern part of the state. Our story with these communities is similar perhaps to other states. Through a succession of treaties and history, communities, tribes, families were removed and isolated, these tribal nations and communities, while the population of tribes was decimated by a combination of conflict and living conditions over time. So my main point here is when you take a look at the map that's on the right, you have to understand that what you see is the result of a historical process. And at the same time, it is a modern day reality. These are communities and real people that exist in present time. You can hop in your car and go see them. And so they kind of exist on both of those dimensions at once, both historical and contemporary. It's also important to understand that part of that history is the establishment of 16 boarding schools in the state of Minnesota. We had a lot of boarding schools here. And if you are at least somewhat familiar with the history of boarding schools and the relationship of boarding schools with tribes, you'll understand that the result of that is a historical legacy of distrust with public education systems growing out of the boarding school system, even with the opening of our state's public schools, eventually K-12, to Native American students. With federal relocation programs, social and economic opportunities in other places, many families were attracted and moved to urban areas. So we have very large Native American populations in our urban centers, which include Duluth, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. Today, students can self-identify when they're asked what their race or ethnicity is as American Indian or Alaska Native, and they attend public schools all over the state, urban, suburban, and rural. I talked briefly about the legacy of boarding schools in the state of Minnesota, and I cannot emphasize enough the importance of understanding how the boarding school era impacts even today the relationship of tribes and even Native American families and students in terms of relationships to our public education system today. So I share these images to try and convey something about what the boarding school experience was like. I also do it with deep and profound respect because the students you see in these photos are the grandparents, great grandparents, certainly the ancestors of people who are alive today and persons. And we need to respect what happened with the boarding schools and give it due consideration, even when we start talking about something like utilizing data to serve students with disabilities. It's part of the picture, and I want you to keep that in mind as we talk a little bit today. Statewide enrollment, we have about 872,000 students in 500 more or less school districts and charter schools in the state of Minnesota. Those are the big numbers. And I say more or less 500 because it's still pretty easy to start a charter school in the state of Minnesota if you can find an authorizer. So sometimes the number is 500 or a little bit more. And sometimes charter schools don't survive and the number goes down a little bit. Now, keeping that big number in mind, we have 15,081 American Indian or Alaskan Native students. They comprise 1.7% of our statewide enrollment, and that's from 2021. Of those 15,081 American Indian or Alaskan Native students, 4,155 at our last December child count were American Indian or Alaskan Native students with disabilities, age birth to 21. And the subset within that, school age 5 to 21, is 3,895. I want you to do a little quick math in your head because you can see that if 15,081 comprises 1.7%, when we start talking about American Indian students with disabilities, we really start taking a look at a small proportion in relation to statewide enrollment. A couple of things happen when numbers are that small, or those proportions, and you're probably familiar with at least one or two of these, if not all three. First thing is state level summary statistics dilute and mask the status of small student populations. And especially when you take the smallest group of students, American Indian students, and then the smallest within that, the American Indian students with disabilities, you can understand that the status of those students is easy to mask in large state level statistics. And even with disaggregation by conventional race ethnicity categories, the numbers can still remain masked and hidden. I think that we're all learning pretty good lessons in intersectionality. So we are learning to take a look at combined groups. So for example, American Indian students and those with disabilities in a combined way. That hasn't been an easy journey. And one lesson I think that we have seen in Minnesota is that without accessible demographic disaggregation of data, the status of these proportionally smaller groups of students is simply not apparent. One thing that we've done in the state of Minnesota, and if we had a little more time, I would show you sometime, is we work very hard to make our data publicly accessible and manipulable so that the public can go to our agency website, and you can do this on your own. And you can go to our data analysis section and pull up data about American Indian students with disabilities, graduation rates, things like that. We did that in the belief that if we are really going to identify issues for students, we have to have data that's publicly accessible, transparent, and utilizable, I think is the term, okay? This stuff is important because if a small student group is historically not of concern, if there's a historical pattern of disregard for the needs of particular students for one reason or another, the state level summary statistics on their own will probably not highlight the status of that student group. So we try to use data in the state of Minnesota through that public accessibility piece I talked about to raise concern despite historical patterns. And our state personnel development grant really grows out of prioritization of that at the Minnesota Department of Education. Let me talk to you a little bit more about that. Statistics of concern are what I call them. And I use this phrase because I think a statistic on its own can exist objectively, and may or may not be compelling, may or may not be concerning. But when we talk about statistics, the important piece is when we attach concern about them. We have an expectation that they should be somewhere where they're simply not, okay? In the state of Minnesota, when it was time for us to identify our simmer those years ago, a few things happened. One thing is awareness was raised because the Minneapolis Star Tribune ran an article about graduation rates in the state of Minnesota. And it was interesting because the headline was, those rates are going up, things are getting better. More kids are graduating in a timely manner. The article also detailed that the only problem is when you disaggregate the data, we find that actually graduation rates are declining for certain groups of students, okay? The Star Tribune ran that about the same time we were all sitting around the table trying to figure out what our simmer would be for the state of Minnesota. And like I described it, in reports, it sounds very formal, but I wish we could somehow share these very human moments where people are sitting around a table saying, okay, what are we going to do? And, my own personal story is coming out of a language revitalization program at a small American Indian Family Center in St. Paul. So I kind of had that on mind. The largest gap that we saw, no matter how we cut the data, was for American Indian students with disabilities compared to any other group, okay? They graduate at lower rates than their peers in the state of Minnesota back then, and I'll show you in a little bit, probably still now. They have higher dropout rates, which is sort of, the other side of that. And the low graduation rates persist over time. They don't bump up that much. So back then we decided to take a courageous step with our first state personnel development grant. And we decided we're going to take on the biggest gap. Let's improve graduation rates for American Indian students with disabilities. At the same time, we also wanted to attend to our Black students with disabilities in the state of Minnesota because the graduation gap was huge there as well. And it was magnified by the number of Black students with disabilities that we serve in our public schools in the state of Minnesota. So our first state personnel development grant focused on both of those groups. And I'm going to tell you how that changed over time. So in terms of graduation rates for American Indian students with disabilities, if you're like me, you run the numbers all the time just because, you work so hard every day and you lose sleep and everything else. We, all of us, I think, throw a lot of energy at this thing, and we like to peruse numbers and see, are we making any progress? Okay. And recently, I had one of these gut check moments. It's like, I got to see the numbers, let's see how we're doing, right? So I just pulled 6-year graduation rates from American Indian, Alaska Native students with disabilities in Minnesota off of our publicly accessible data. I love being able to see what anyone in the public is able to see, okay? And I saw this nice positive curve, and I thought, wow, okay, so we're doing okay here. I mean, we started 51% back in 2016. We've tried to do some intentional things and especially with some focused effort. And we have a bumper. We're looking at 60% here in 2020. So I thought that's pretty good, right? And then wonderful OSEP Fast Facts. What a mixed bag, right? Okay, because I'm sitting there, wow, we're doing pretty good. We're up in the 60s, And then OSEP Fast Facts comes out and I start taking a look. Hey, how's this compared to national statistics? Okay. And I take a look at this one, American Indian or Alaska Native students with disabilities, 14 to 21. And what is this I'm seeing here? 76%. So right away, you're like, okay, I gotta get it. Is this a 4-year rate or a 6-year rate? Yeah, okay, there's things I can take a look at, but it tells me, yeah, there's still some work to be done, all right, especially in the state of Minnesota. And I'm totally cool with that because that's what we're doing with our state personnel development grant. So if anything, I positively reframe that as, look, we have still wonderful opportunity to increase graduation rates for American Indian students with disabilities. Other data comes out too. Once in a while, many of you get the IES NCES data. So I thought, okay, let's take a look at that and kind of the same pattern. Yes, the lowest graduation rates, American Indian, Alaska Native students And, the same pattern kind of holds for students with disabilities. But again, it's like, God, we have this big gap in the state. So this kind of keeps me going in terms of the work. So like I said, came back 60%, lots of room to move. All right. In Minnesota, we have a standard approach that we've taken. We do work with CSEP to use implementation science, active implementation frameworks in our work. So basically our formula is when we want to make change happen, we're looking for a usable innovation. In our first SPDG, Check and Connect was something we used. We use effective implementation methods. We pay attention to stages and drivers. Okay, this picture should look important. We have enabling context. We try to use solid teams and work them through improvement cycles. And when we do all these things, we expect educationally significant outcomes to happen, right? It's a system that works. It's flexible and adaptive too. So if we need to tweak things for one thing or another at the local level or even at the state level, we're able to do that. The one hitch with it has always been, but where to do all of that implementation work, okay? We have a system that kind of works, but we need to know where should we go with it, okay? Where can we go to cause the usable innovation to be used so it actually has an impact? Some questions immediately, kind of come to mind right away. So in our first state personnel development grant, we want to use data to go specifically where the students are, okay? Or as many places as possible to make that local level change that would impact the state level statistic. So, and this was some years ago and we do our best. So this was a lot of spreadsheets, right? So what we do is we start out with disaggregated school district graduation rate data. And we use the disaggregated district enrollment data in combination with that for American Indian Black students with disabilities. And then I thought, okay, let's do something clever. There's gotta be a mathematical way to combine these data sets and figure out which are the school districts that have a good combination of large enrollment rates and a graduation rate that needs to be addressed. And this is, we do not have fancy pivot tables or anything. I use Excel spreadsheets. This was basically get all the cells filled in, use the sort and figure out what's happening. At the time, we had this idea of a graduation problem index. So we thought if we, and mathematicians cover one ear, okay, but this was the best attempt. We took the inverse of the rate of graduation. We thought, okay, so great, where graduation is happening, we want to flip that around so that you'd be less likely to be picked if you're doing well on graduation rates. And then we want something to do with magnitude. So we multiply the inverse of the graduation rate to come up with something around places that have a numerical index around possibility or opportunity, or what I called probable impact, a best guess. And then we basically, in an Excel spreadsheet, we just use sort to take a look at how do districts rank on this and does it make sense? We added a few more things to that. One would be demonstrated prioritization and readiness to engage with American Indian students with disabilities, and at that time too with that SPDG, Black students with disabilities as well. And the evidence was, pretty low on Stevens scales of measurement. We used some checklist items like, had they implemented PBIS? Had they implemented another evidence-based practice? Had they completed any version of self-assessment? Most importantly, ultimately as well, was whether or not when we began initial conversations with the top school districts, did we have local level buy-in from the administration in terms of not only being ready, having some experience, having some metrics behind it, but was the administration actually ready and willing to work on something? We got lucky. The top 4 school districts that we contacted met all the criteria, and especially most important, magic sometimes happens when you show the data, hey, here's what we're seeing at the state, here's what's kind of happening maybe in your neck of the woods. Wonder if you want to work on this, right? So our first districts in our first SPDG were St. Paul, Osseo, Minneapolis, and Duluth. And they worked on our 6-year graduation for American Indian and Black students with disabilities, okay? During this first SPDG, in our first presentation with Shimobi, there was a little bit of discussion around the importance of qualitative data. I really want to highlight that in terms of it does two things. Number one, it tells you if you're on the right track when you're working with historically underserved students with disabilities and their families. And it also gives you the directions you want to head in the future in terms of what to pay attention to in doing a good comprehensive evaluation of your work. We did student focus groups as part of our first SPDG, and we asked kids, what do you see as the factors that contribute to low graduation rates? And the information you get is just, it's wonderful how straightforward it is, you know? The kids said, we're not getting enough help from our teachers. And this was a pattern, okay? A big one, and we've seen this in research literature, simply low teacher expectations. Teachers didn't expect me to accomplish much. And that fades into whether or not I feel like going to school, staying in school, and getting across the graduation finish line. Asking what things should the school district change? Kids would say, help teachers have higher expectations for us. Have them look at us as capable students, okay? And build self-advocacy skills in students. Teach us to ask for what we need to be successful in school. We also took a look at engaging families, and self-advocacy skills for families were just as important as self-advocacy skills for students. And a consistent finding was find ways to increase teacher and engagement and communication with the family so that there was actually a partnership developed between what was going on in school for a student and what's going on with a family. Other things we figured out during the first SPDG, when you're working with historically underserved students, the key word is underserved. So one of the most important things you want to keep track of, or we figured out we wanted to keep track of was, well, are we actually serving students? Are we increasing the number of students that receive the evidence-based practice that will improve their chances of graduating from high school? So we developed some systems to simply track scaling up of the evidence-based practice and the number of students participating in it. If the problem is serving, then one of the most important things we figured out we can measure is how many students are now being served versus before. This was not too complicated. You know, you're just asking for these numbers. How many kids are participating? And you can actually have, if they need a certain window of participation, you know, throughout the year, you can ask questions around that. But in our case, we figured out scale up is hugely important data. So I'll tell you, the short version is sometimes, you know, people want to think about what are the most important types of data that we should really be looking at for those historically underserved kids. I have good news for you. The important types of data that you've probably learned for implementing any evidence-based practice are still just as important, if not more important, for historically underserved students and making a difference in their educational success. It's effort, fidelity, and outcome. In effort, we're trying to serve the students who have been historically underserved. We want to provide something to them. We want to know how often, how much. Most importantly, if we're going to try to do something, fidelity is just as important. We need to know that we are providing it in the way that it needs to be provided in order to be effective. And in the narrow definitions of fidelity, yes, that's measurable around key components or aspects of practice profiles, but also fidelity includes those more general questions too that need to be considered. Are we providing this in the way it's supposed to be provided and needs to be provided to the students? Outcome data, you know, the data is still just as important, if not more important, for historically underserved students. If the reason we got into this business was low graduation rates and graduation gaps, then yeah, definitely we want to be paying attention to outcome data, both things that lead up to graduation and perhaps intermediate outcomes that we know are associated with graduation. Another lesson too is the importance of linked implementation teams all of the time. And it's important to consider the function and the composition of a team, this isn't just sort of something mechanical where we have data and we're sharing about it and talking about it, just in terms of isolated categories of effort, fidelity, and outcome. But it's important to think about who is on the team, because root cause analysis of data is driven by the people on your team, okay? In the first SPDG, we tried some innovative stuff. We tried to get Indian education offices to sit at the table at the same time with special education offices. That's not something that consistently happens in the state of Minnesota and probably doesn't happen consistently enough. Admittedly, our first attempts at this were mixed. In times and places, it worked great. At other times and places, silos would kick in. SPDG is a special ed thing. This is your money. We need to go do something else. In our second SPDG, we're really shooting for having a lot more collaboration between Indian education offices and special education offices, because we know that the best team composition in this linked team structure happens when we have all of the school staff and perhaps even tribal community members, if possible, partnered in those teams to take a look at implementation and data simultaneously and making the adjustments that need to happen. So basically, I told you I describe our experience in Minnesota. I would describe it as sort of a data-driven adaptation over time. I think in our experience, we got, when you start out with a state personnel development grant, you have an idea about how it's going to go, and then you get into it. And some stuff works and some stuff doesn't. But what's pretty valuable is that the whole time you are hopefully learning lessons and making those adjustments. So over time, we had our first SPDG, and that was from 2015 to 2020. A key turning point for us in 2020, we asked the Indian Education Office, again, where are the students? And this time I asked, I had this hunch that we're missing a piece. And we asked the Indian Education Office, are there more American Indian students with disabilities in these urban and suburban areas, or are there more students in rural and outstate Minnesota? And our Indian Education Office came back and said, you are onto something. There are more, or actually the vast majority of American Indian students, including students with disabilities, are located in rural outstate Minnesota. So that gave us a pretty fast clue on what we needed to do if we could get another state personnel development grant opportunity. We still wanted to focus on graduation rates for these students, but we knew we needed to get somewhere else, okay? So the problems also arose in terms of when you move to taking a look at students in outstate and rural areas, a number of things came up right away. There's two diaspora problems, and I'll give you the short version. Number one, diaspora problem number one, American Indian students with disabilities are located all over the state. As a result of that history of removal and relocation, some of the students are with families on reservations, they're in surrounding communities, they're in urban areas, and depending on labor markets over time, they're all over the state. Diaspora problem number two is, although they're all over their state, you could pick any one given place, and perhaps even through historical intentions, there are not too many American Indian students and families, including students with disabilities, in one place. There's a lot of spread and sort of scattering all over the state without good concentration. There's an isolation problem as well, perhaps growing out of history. The higher numbers of American Indian students are in outstate rural school districts at great distances from urban centers, great distances from resources, and actually even from each other if you take a look at concentrations. This also complicates relationships with our state agencies, and I'll tell you, even including our Department of Education, because we are officed in Roseville, which is a suburb of St. Paul. And a lot of our operations and the places we live and the things that come to mind tend to be urban and suburban oriented. And when you start talking about outstate rural school districts, especially the furthest reaches, sometimes there are times and places where our relationship with those school districts has not been consistent and building a good relationship over time. couple other things too. Resource sparsity out in rural areas is also something that grows out of the patterns of diaspora and isolation I talked about. And at the same time, where are significant needs seen? Certainly in our urban areas, but we do a student survey every 2 years that takes a look specifically at health and mental health needs. And we do find some of our highest needs. For example, students with the highest probability of thinking about or attempting suicide are in outstate Minnesota, especially in communities associated with our reservations. So our 2025 SPDG data, we tried to figure out how are we going to pick school districts. This time we did not try to do a clever index to figure out where to go. We decided we're just going to take a look at, can we make some statements around the number of students served and the proportion of those students in enrollment to just try and find those school districts in outstate Minnesota that had the I should say, the highest proportion of American Indian students with disabilities. So we're doing things a little bit differently this time. This process is happening right now. We have our request for proposal out and are contacting school districts that we think are likely candidates. They're places that you probably haven't heard from if you're not from Minnesota. And a few of these, even if you're in Minnesota, you might not even know where they are. This tells me we're on the right track. These are our school districts with high proportions of the students that we're looking for. And with this SPDG, we hope to get to them. Possible challenges, quick notes. Yep, probably the same as everyone else on this call is working with. Pandemic burnout is out there. We've had a lot of initiatives, and it's hard to work on initiatives when you have a pandemic on top of everything. We're working real hard on recovery. With the rural school districts, if your state education agency hasn't had consistent and frequent contact, there's a relationship bridge that needs to be built. And so in this work right now, I spent a lot of time trying to make person-to-person contacts with special education directors. There's always a lack of resources out there as well. So as much as we're trying to bring resources to outstate school districts, we also need to recognize that they may not have other supporting resources, and that's going to be an important thing to factor into implementation. So I start out with a few questions. I hope I've conveyed something about our experience in Minnesota. I'm noting it's 3:21 right now. I haven't seen the chat, so I have no idea what's going on in there. But maybe I should pause here and let's see if, are there questions in the chat?
There was one from Peg much earlier, so I don't know if she wants to speak to that at this point, but we can certainly open up for people to use their mics or the chat. Generally, just to help with people's thinking, we have quite a few from new SPDIC grantees from fiscal year 20, the cohort, and then fiscal year 21, that cohort. So Tom in Minnesota in the 20, we now have the 21. And even the 20s are still thinking about this, right? Like last year wasn't a great year to get off the ground quickly. And the 21s are certainly thinking about this because most of them are starting October 1st, but may be on with us because they have a previous grant or they're just starting to join us. So there's a lot of thinking about getting started and how you select districts or early childhood programs and what that looks like, what CSEP calls, oh gosh, what do they call it, Tom? It's both directions, the selection.
Oh, I don't know the term.
I'll think of it. Word retrieval is not great for me today, but it's bi-directional selection. Basically, the district needs to be ready to choose you, or the early childhood program does, and you need to be ready to choose them. And that means being real clear, as Tom was sharing, about why they're choosing certain places. And then beyond this, something that Tom didn't get into, but Minnesota's done a great job of, is being able to share what you have to give in the relationship that's going to be built, right? What you're going to expect of your partner that you're working with and what you're going to be able to give them as well. And Minnesota has called that the give and get chart, right? We're going to give, we're going to get. And so that's the next step, kind of beyond what Tom has been talking about here today. But what really strikes me in this presentation is how much you're doing to understand the community, their history, where they are now. I'm sure you're still going to be learning a lot as you develop the relationship and as you start to provide services for the underserved. But understanding the history, understanding where people are now. If you want to get an equity, you're going to have to understand that, and you're going to have to understand what surrounds the school, the early childhood program, and how you work with community organizations and other groups in that community. So Patty Noonan does have a question for you. Do you want to read it or do you want me to?
Let's see if I can read it. What are the main evidence-based practices you are focusing on to address rural and remote isolation issues? Working with a high school on a reservation where some students are bused 2 hours each way on buses that accrue over 100,000 miles per year. That sounds like my pickup truck. Okay. So up to this point, in the 4 school districts in our first SPDG, they all did choose Check and Connect as the evidence-based practice to implement. 2 pieces of context around that are that Check and Connect, we have the office, right, the University of Minnesota, so it's, you know, you do get pretty good support when it's in your backyard. Also, there's been previous successful use of Check and Connect in the Fond du Lac reservation. And so when it came time to talking about specifically American Indian students with disabilities, Fond du Lac's successful experience with Check and Connect was something that really traveled through informal networks in Indian education offices across the state. And it's interesting because it still carries a lot of weight in the conversation. When you want to talk about Check and Connect, if you just mention Fond du Lac, all of a sudden, you know, people who have been in education for a while know exactly what you're talking about. So
And Tom, will you quickly just, because I know you mentioned it earlier in your presentation, but I don't think you said what it, just in case somebody doesn't know what the intervention is, could you do a brief description?
about Check and Connect?
Mhm.
Sure. Okay. So Check and Connect has multiple components. If I were to sum it up briefly, it is the type of, boy, what do I want to call it? Core components around paying attention to the actual daily experience and progress of students with disabilities in school. It's multidimensional. If you are a Check and Connect mentor assigned to a student, you start the day making sure the student comes to school. You may start in with a check-in before classes even begin. You may review the goals of the student for that day. You're meeting with teachers, you're troubleshooting every possible thing that's happening for a student. So for me, it kind of, the way we started alternative schools, I always called it like benevolent harassment. Or that concept of extreme ownership again. This is your kid, and they have circumstances in life of one kind or another that are increasing the risk that they won't graduate. So my main job is all day long, I am your best friend. And I know your family too. You talk to the parents, make connections, troubleshoot all the connections there. So that's how I would sum up Check and Connect. Great. It's a great practice. It works. I don't know yet what our next cohort of school districts will choose. Might be Check and Connect. One quick note, and I think my colleagues from Montana might be on here too, as always, when you're talking about data and evidence-based practice, we bear in mind when we're working with tribal communities that evidence-based practice is a cultural construct. So you will also encounter other ideas of, we also have evidence-based practices, and there are resiliency building efforts in tribal communities or in family centers for Native American families that also have at least some measured results for kids in terms of building resiliency. Language revitalization is one that I worked on, and it's amazing. Although a lot of things you see in Check and Connect, if you're running a language revitalization group correctly with kids, it's the same thing. It's that relationship building with the students and constant checking in.
Okay. I did want to mention, well, we have one more question, and Patty says thank you for that. But I did want to mention, you know, when you think back to, I was so excited that you all were doing focus groups for your ASIP, the previous ASIP. or the current SIP, previous FDIC, I should say. And it, you can see a straight line between the needs that the students were saying, that they're saying they weren't getting enough support from the teachers, and then having this mentor who is a person working at the school really made a lot of sense. And in terms of Terry's question was about what your state's SIP was focused on, and it was the graduation rates of African American and American Indian students.
That's right. That's the high level objective measure. And what I think is interesting is that you can see from the student focus groups, and when you think about a Check and Connect mentor, that piece around expectations for students and also the aspirations the students have for themselves, that's a piece that ties in, may not get captured in the data processes that we use. But if you want to get a kid across the graduation line, two of the most valuable conversations you can actually, we'll say three, talk with the teachers around having high expectations for these kids, believe in them, talking to the students themselves and saying, you are very capable. We have a deep conviction and belief about that with you. And, with all the research that we've had for decades around parental aspiration for students, we also know that's an important conversation. And in Check and Connect implementation, those are the three conversations that a Check and Connect mentor is ideally having.
Great. Excellent. Good. Okay. Well, we are right at time, so it was a perfect stopping place. And Tom, I apologize. I said Lakota language. It was Dakota language that I meant to refer to, because I don't think you mentioned this in the slide where you're telling your background, but you're learning the Dakota language, correct?
That's right. They're related, and yes, it's more regional, and there's a little bit of a dialectical difference in pronunciation, but it's okay. Just even knowing Lakota is a good thing.
Okay, excellent. No, I think it's very exciting. And everyone is talking about how much they got out of your presentation. So thank you for putting that together. I think, today's presentation, both from Chimobi and Tom, what's been important to me is that we talk about this big equity. And I think I feel the need to figure out what that means on the ground. What does it mean in terms of the data you're looking at? What is, how does that drive your actions? And so I think we really got into that a bit today in a way that, like I said, is hopefully helpful for those of you who are just starting things off in your grant. But also there are many of you who will be writing applications next year, and hopefully it helps your thinking about that too in terms of selection criteria. So appreciate you all being on. And of course, we'll hear Kristen Brown from Colorado talk about MTSS at our September director's webinar. Thank you, Kristen, for putting that together and being flexible about when you present it, and appreciate it. She's ready. She's ready to go. She's just going to stay at that desk until September 5th or whatever it happens to be. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.